Whatever you prefer.
Well, you can have this one if you like. If you don't
I'm
mind
happy,
hanging
I'm
on.
happy to use this one.
Okay.
Well, thank you all for coming this morning, and I did make it on time, so I won't apologise for being late. But there is a handout here, so do you want to
I can go
pass
down
that
the
around?
handout,
And,
I'll
it's
start.
just really something to take away from the talk as well. And, okay, so by way of background, a lot of the research that I've been doing at the University of the Sunshine Coast and elsewhere over the last few years has been trying to see whether traditional stories, particularly of Indigenous people, might actually have meaning. And I'm interested particularly in stories that refer to geographical and geological phenomena. And the study that was just referred to was one that I did a few years ago on the drowning of the Australian coast. So during the last ice age, the sea level was about 120 meters lower than it is today. And we know pretty much, science knows pretty much how it tracks and rose up to its present level about 7,000 years ago. And with a linguist colleague, we actually found 22 groups of stories from Australian Aboriginal tribes all the way around the Australian coast that recalled a time when the sea level was lower and it rose up and covered coastal lands. And when I first came across these stories, I thought to myself, no, that's impossible. People can't have kept stories or memories alive for 7,000 years or more. But the more I read, the more I realized that that was the only possible conclusion, that those stories about coastal drowning must have been passed down from generation to generation for more than 7,000 years, which is, however you like to measure it, 230 to 300 generations of people. Adults telling youngsters, youngsters telling their children, and so on and so on. So my most recent area of research in this, with colleagues from Monash University, has been to look at volcanic eruptions in Australia and whether, in fact, any Australian Aboriginal stories might recollect volcanic activity or volcanic eruptions. And of course, I realise that I've sort of thrown two things out there that you're probably finding very, very difficult to understand. Number one is that there's been volcanic activity in Australia, which is always regarded as a geologically benign continent. You know, nothing has happened here for millions and millions of years. And that's true of most places, but not true of every part of Australia. And the second thing that I've probably challenged you with is the idea that memories, human memories, amongst non-literate people can actually survive for 7,000 years or more. So I'm going to try in the next 40 minutes or so to at least plant the seeds in your minds that these kinds of things may be possible. So the talk I want to give today is about Australian Aboriginal recollections of volcanic activity in Australia. And I've got the punchline, when our oven's filled with water. You'll see the relevance of that in a minute. Okay, so before I talk about Australian traditions, let me just jump to the Western United States. And I've never been to Crater Lake in Oregon, but it's on my bucket list. Okay, so it's really just a question of persuading my wife that it's actually going to be a really fun place to go. Anyhow, Crater Lake in Oregon, this is how it looks. There's Wizard Island there. And Crater Lake formed as a result of a volcanic eruption. There used to be a huge volcano here. We call it today Mount Mazama. But we don't know what it was called in the old days, of course. But there used to be a huge volcano there, and one day, or probably took longer than one day, there was a massive eruption of this volcano. It blew itself to bits, and it basically collapsed into the underground magma chamber beneath. And it formed a crater, actually properly called a caldera, in this particular location. And we know, because geologists can find these things out, we know that this occurred pretty much about 7,700 years ago. Now, when the first literate people, the first Europeans, came to this part of the United States, Oregon, they talked to the local indigenous people, the Klamath Indian tribe, and the Klamath said, we keep away from this place. We keep away from this place. And they told the story. They told the story about how there used to be an enormous mountain there, and how that mountain, there was a god inside it who fell in love, of course, with a lady from outside it, and that God wasn't going to settle for anyone else apart from this lady. So pursued her, but she wasn't interested, and so called upon the God of the outside world to come and sort him out. So there was a big battle. And as usual, it was all about... No, I can't say that these days because it's sexist. It was all about interpersonal relations. That's the politically correct phrase. Okay. Anyhow, to resolve the issue of interpersonal relations between the god of the volcano and the lady outside, the god of the outside world fought, and there was a lot of banging and crashing, and eventually the god of the outside world caused the volcano to bury the god of the volcano inside. And that's why the Klamath kept away from the place, because they knew that there was a very evil god inside the buried volcano there. Anyhow, the point here is that this is clearly a recollection or a memory of a volcanic eruption, of a volcano that once existed, which erupted, it exploded, and it caused a caldera, or crater, if you like, to form a crater of this kind. And that happened 7,700 years ago. So the inescapable conclusion is that the Klamath Indians of Oregon in the western United States have preserved a tradition, largely orally, for more than 7,000 years as well. So that's just to show that Australia is not unique, although it's pretty unique. This is Kangaroo Island in South Australia, as viewed from the Fleurieu Peninsula on the mainland of Australia. It's about 30 kilometres broad, and there's a ferry, as you can see, that goes across. And this is what it looks like. The gap is called Backstairs Passage. Backstairs Passage. Here's the mainland, and here's Kangaroo Island out here. And we have stories, there are stories, many stories in fact, that talk about a time when Backstairs Passage was dry land, when people could walk from the mainland, what is now the mainland, to what is now Kangaroo Island offshore. And there are many of these stories, and today the depth is around 32 to 35 meters. So the last time that it would have been dry, allowing people to cross, would have been more than 10,000 years ago. So we can do it fairly precisely, 10,080 to 10,950 years ago. Sometime in there was the last time that Backstairs Passage was dry land. And so again, the inescapable conclusion seems to be that the stories about people walking across Backstairs Passage regularly, if they are true, if they're based on observations, then those observations must have been made more than 10,000 years ago. So, what I want to talk about this morning, yes.
Yes.
And him.
Beautiful.
So, might be a her actually.
I'm sorry.
It's a gender neutral talk this morning. Anyhow, the first thing I want to talk about is establishing the time frame. There's been a lot of new research recently that has slightly extended the time frame that we have for the first human occupation of Australia. So I want to talk about, very briefly, about when people first arrived.
Could you possibly put it closer?
Yes, of course.
Thank you very much.
Sorry. I want to talk about when the first people arrived in Australia. So what is the time frame for this? Then I want to talk about the young volcanic activity in Australia, and confess, of course, that science doesn't have the whole story here. In fact, scientists are spending a lot of time scratching their heads, wondering why volcanic activity did occur. And then the third thing I want to talk about is the main thing, which is Australian Aboriginal stories about volcanic activity in Australia, and whether or not they could be true. And then the last thing is, what might all this mean? Okay, so accepting that stories can endure for such a long period of time, well, what does that mean? And why are we only finding out about this today, quite recently? Why didn't we know about this long ago? So the first part of this morning's talk is establishing the time frame when people first arrived in Australia. Now, there has been quite a lot of archaeological research in Australia over the last 100 years or more, and while a lot of it has focused on no, it's okay. Yeah. While a lot of it is focused on more recent times, the earliest sites that we know about, and this is in your handout on the first page, in case you can't see it. But the earliest sites that we know about are mostly in the Northern Territory, in Arnhem Land, Malakunanja, and Nawalambilla. Over there in the Pilbara, Carpenter's Gap, Nimby, a very strange outlier south of Perth called Devil's Lair, and then two inland sites, Lake Mungo and possibly not Lake George, but certainly Lake Mungo, there in the Murray-Darling Basin. So those basically are the earliest known human settlement sites in Australia. Now, for most of the time that people have lived in Australia, Australia has been connected to Papua New Guinea by dry land. So again, we can't try to understand the human history or the early human history of Australia without acknowledging that Papua New Guinea was also part of the mix, so to speak. And let's look at some of those dates. Lake George is very much an outlier. This scale here is 150 to 150,000 years ago, 75,000 years ago today. Lake George is very much an outlier, and most people don't think that it's a valid indicator of a human presence in Australia. Most of the valid indicators actually cluster around 60 to 65,000 years ago. 60 to 65,000 years ago. That seems to be about the time that people first arrived in Australia. And you'll see that those dates are, the earliest dates are from the Northern Territory dates, Arnhem Land dates, and they're both well inland, even today. So we have to think people didn't come there straight away. People landed on the coast, which was the edge of the yellow there, and it probably took them several hundred years to actually reach Malakunanja and Nawalambilla. So 65 is probably a minimum age there. There's been research published in the last 2 months which talks about Malakunanja dates. They've been pushed back to 65,000 years. So if you go to the online conversation online, you can find reference to that. So quite fascinating. Anyhow, 65,000 years seems to be about the right time for people arriving in Australia. So, since that time, have they experienced volcanic activity? Has anyone witnessed volcanic activity? Well, let's talk first of all about what science knows. Australia and Tasmania are part of a landmass that is attached to an oceanic section of the Earth's crust, and that section of the Earth's crust is moving slowly, very slowly, slightly to the east of north. So it's moving, has been moving for 40 million years or so in that direction. So for the past 34 million years or so, Australia's been moving north-northeast. And as it moved, like many other chunks of the Earth's crust, as it moved, it passed over places where liquid rock rises up from the Earth's interior. So these are what we commonly call mantle plumes. So from the Earth's mantle, great mushrooms of liquid rock develop, and some of it actually escapes to the Earth's surface, forming volcanoes. So it doesn't mean that Australia is intrinsically volcanically active. It just means that certain places in Australia have experienced volcanic activity as the result of passing over a mantle plume. And this is the main mantle plume in this part of Australia. Today, it sits underneath much of Tasmania, but Australia in the past was down here. So Australia has been moving slowly across this mantle plume, which has been unmoving. It's been moving slowly in that direction. So we have something here called the Cosgrove Hotspot Track. That actually marks the progress of Australia across the mantle plume. And it's there on the second page of the handout, so you can take it home and you can think all about it tonight. But basically 33.6 million years ago, the mantle plume was up here. And Australia has been moving like that since then. So volcanoes have erupted all the way along the Cosgrove Hotspot Track. One of the youngest, and still quite old, is nearly 9 million years old. That's the Cosgrove volcano in northern Victoria. So, the Cosgrove Hotspot Track is the name given to this line of volcanoes. And this is one of the earliest volcanoes to have formed. This is part of the Mount Jukes volcano, nearly 33 million years ago. So, they still look pretty much like volcanoes even today. Now, the Glasshouse Mountains, which are fairly close to us, they are the remains of volcanoes that erupted 26 million years ago. They're not part of the Cosgrove Track. So as Australia was moving this way, it went across this mantle plume, it went across other mantle plumes that are responsible for other volcanoes forming to the east of the Cosgrove Track. So these are the Glasshouse Mountains, as you know, and the hotspot track, or the mantle plume that they passed over, was the Glasshouse Mountains about 23 million years ago. It was north of Noosa, between Noosa and Fraser, about 70 million years ago. No, I got that wrong, sorry. So it was between Noosa and Fraser about 28 million years ago. It got to the Glasshouse Mountains about 26 million years ago, and then the hotspot volcanoes developed later than that. So again, without going into great detail, what I'm trying to say, the point I'm trying to make here is that there has been volcanic activity associated with Australia passing over these mantle plumes, and it's only in eastern Australia that this has happened. So, now we get to the really interesting part. The most recent bursts of volcanic activity have nothing to do with mantle plumes or hotspots. And this is where scientists are still scratching their heads, wondering why. In far north Queensland and in southern Australia, both South Victoria and southwest SA, southeast SA, we've had volcanic activity within recent times. Why it has occurred is something of a mystery, and I guarantee you it's still a mystery, although I'm sure you could find someone to come and tell you exactly what caused it. But the truth is that we don't really know. So let's have a look at some of these. It includes lakes Yuramu, Barine, and Eacham. This is Barine. It's a typical Maar lake, M-A-A-R, which I think is a German word. And I'm going to have to put this down for a second because I need all my hands. But a Maar, M-A-A-R, is where you have liquid rock coming up from the Earth's interior that encounters cold groundwater. And where the two meet, boom, there's a massive explosion. And what you actually get is liquid rock fanning out from a single source, like a fountain like that. So you get liquid rock coming up there, fountaining out, and making a circle like that. So you get a build-up of lava in a circular ridge around the center of the old volcano. And that's called a Maar. And because you create a basin, it can fill with rainwater, and so you get these Maar lakes, like you do in far north Queensland. So they're on the Atherton tableland. They are classic Maar volcanoes, that have become filled with water. The second group that I want to talk about are down here in south of Australia. This is something that geologists call the newer volcanic province, or the newer volcanics province. And this is another typical marked volcano, Mount Shank, in South Australia. It's not filled with water, but it could be filled with water, I suppose, but maybe the water leaks out. Anyhow, you get the sense of this circular structure in that place. So, why don't we understand what caused this young volcanic activity in northern Queensland and southern Australia? Well, part of the reason is that rocks weather, they break down very rapidly in the Australian climate. And if they break down, it's very difficult to find anything in them that you can use to date scientifically, that you can actually determine the age of the rock in which it is. So typically, because the products of these eruptions, and I'll show you some in a minute, are too weathered, they're too broken down to be able to determine the age of them. But we have another way, perhaps, of trying to understand them. This is not from Australia. This is from Mount St. Helens in the northwest USA. And the point I'm trying to make here is that there were people in Australia at the time these volcanoes erupted, almost certainly. And therefore, perhaps the people witnessed those eruptions. And if they witnessed those eruptions, is it possible that some of their memories of these eruptions have in fact reached us today? Now, I want you all to look at this picture very carefully, because I want you to see if you can see the eagle, okay? Because the people in the northwest United States at the time of this eruption talked about a giant eagle that was attacking something on top of the mountain, causing that thing to bleed and so on and so on. So, okay, I'm sure you can all see the eagle. Here's the eagle's beak, the yellow bit there. Here's the eagle's head, and those are the eagle's wings stretched out like that. Okay, so yeah, absolutely. I couldn't believe it. And it's really interesting, because I don't know if any of you have read Greek myths. The myth of Prometheus. Prometheus wanted to give, or gave humans the gift of fire, which really annoyed Zeus. So he chained Prometheus to a mountain, and a giant eagle came and attacked Prometheus every night. And sorry for the younger people in the audience, but the blood from Prometheus ran down the sides of the mountain. Then, because he was immortal, he regenerated, so the next night it happened all over again. So it wasn't great. The point here is that eagle myths are common, not common, but I mean they exist in several parts of the world to explain volcanic eruptions of this kind, but not in Australia. Okay, so what stories do we have about volcanic activity in Australia? I'm going to start by looking at some of the younger volcanoes in the south of Australia, these ones down here. And there are stories about Muirhead and Shank and Gambia, Elephant and Bunning, which is not on the map there. So let's look at some of these stories. And this is the story that's associated with Mount Shank and also Mount Muirhead. And I'll read it to you in case you can't see it clearly from the back. There was once a giant named Cragbull who wandered through South Australia with his family, looking for a place where he might be safe from the evil spirit Tena Te Ona. Tena Te Ona, there's lots of stories about Tena Te Ona, and he was a man, okay, he was a very, very nasty piece of work indeed. And again, there are younger people in the audience, I'm not going to give you all the gory details, but trust me, he was a very unpleasant person. So to escape him, Cragbull and the family settled on Mount Muirhead. And they cook their food in the ground, and that's significant, because we can't cook our food in the ground out there, but we can when the ground is really hot. And they do that in many, many parts of the world where there are active volcanoes. They
cooked their food in the ground, but one night they were awoken by the shrieks of the bulin, which portended the arrival of Tenakuna, so they fled. Tenateona, so they fled. The bulin, we don't know what the bulin was. We don't know. They said it was a bird, but nobody knows exactly what kind of bird, which is why I put the picture of the ferocious emu in there, just in case I get you thinking. So they fled. So what from this story, this is the Aboriginal story, do we know? Cooking in the ground. Was it heated because there was an active volcano below? There was liquid rock below. And was Tenateona actually not a man, but was Tenateona a volcanic eruption? Okay, so you've got to think, how do people who don't have scientific training, how do they conceptualize things like volcanic eruptions? They talk about gods in the ground, and they talk about fighting between gods, and they attribute emotions to these gods to explain the events that unfold. So it's possible that Tenateona was actually the eruption, and the bulin that shrieked was actually the precursors of the eruption. So rather than being a bird, perhaps the bulin was in fact the sound of escaping gas or something like that shrieked. So in this story, if you take away the layers of embellishment, in this story we do have evidence suggesting that this is a recollection of a volcanic eruption. So Craigtill's family fled to Mount Shank, where they cooked also in underground ovens. But one night they were also awoken by the bulin, and they fled again. And eventually they reached Mount Gambier, and they lived there a long time because Tenateona liked to be near the sea apparently. And they cooked in the underground ovens, but one day their underground ovens became filled with water. And it happened again and again and again. And this is what happens with Mars, or Mar craters like this. You have a volcanic eruption and it forms a natural basin, the hardened lava on the outside, like that, with a natural basin in the middle. And if there are no leaks, then that natural basin can become filled with water. So to me, when I read Aboriginal stories about ovens becoming filled with water, it suggests clearly to me that this was a Mar eruption that created a Mar crater that became filled with rainwater. So, does the repeated filling of the ovens recall the filling of the Mar craters with rainwater? A couple of other volcanoes from South Australia. One, Mount Elephant. And you might think, well, were there ever elephants in Australia? No, there weren't. So who knows where the name Mount Elephant came from. But if you go back, in an 1878 book written by one of the missionaries in this area, she noted that the Aboriginal name for Mount Elephant was in fact Jerin Yelam, which means hill of fire. Okay, so why would people have called a mountain hill of fire unless there was something that suggested there was fire within it? And it's a similar story with Mount Buninyong in Victoria. Some of the first stories that were recorded by local people talked about stones around the foot of the mountain that had been thrown out by the action of fire. So again, a recollection, it seems, of a time when these two volcanoes were volcanically active. So, can we actually put a date or a time on the observations from which these memories derive? Well, it's not very good, because I did say that it's difficult to determine the age of young volcanic eruptions in Australia, but it seems fairly sure that somewhere around 4,300 years ago we had an eruption, the last eruption of Mount Shank. So a minimum age for the story would have to be 4,300 years ago. It might be older than that, of course. Mount Gambier formed about 4,800 years ago, and it's not erupted since. Although if you're thinking of buying a retirement home around Mount Gambier, I would suggest staying on the sunny coast. I think that would be my professional advice as a geologist. Don't feel that bad. Okay, so Mount Gambier perhaps about 4,800 years ago, and Mount Elephant about 5,000 years ago. These things are very uncertain. Mount Buninyong we really don't know. So it seems that we're looking at traditions that are between 4,000 and 5,000 years old at least, with the young volcanoes of South Australia. And what this does is it actually confirms what science is trying to understand. So science is saying, well, to the best of our knowledge, there seem to have been volcanic eruptions in this area within the last 65,000 years. And we have stories from indigenous people that actually appear to corroborate that deduction. Okay, now we'll look at some of the young volcanoes in northern Queensland, including Lakes Barine, Itcham and Uramu, and also Kimbra, which I'll talk about. So Lake Itcham is a classic Maar volcano, which has become filled with water, so it's now a lake. The Aboriginal stories about the origin of Lake Itcham, and sometimes they are also extended to Barine and Uramu, is told in many versions. It begins by recalling that two newly initiated youths were confined to camp while their elders went out to collect food. That's a common thing. But the youths were restless. They were probably a bit naughty like most adolescents. And they left camp. They broke the taboo and they found a wallaby and they hunted the wallaby. But they weren't really good at hunting. So they threw a spear at the animal, but instead it hit a flame tree. And that was sacred to the rainbow serpent. So they did something really bad. This is the story. When the elders returned from hunting, it was the middle of the day, but something was clearly wrong. The sky turned blackish red, and shortly after, the earth began to crack and heave, spitting out a liquid that engulfed the camp and all the people in it, forming the three crater lakes. So that's the actual words of a story, and those stories were collected 200 years ago, so there's no possibility that they were informed by scientific understanding of Maar volcanoes and how they develop. So, how old are the observations from which these memories derive? Lake Itcham, we think, formed through an eruption just over 9,000 years ago. And if the stories also apply to Uramu and to Barine, then we're looking at 15,000, 17,000 years ago. But I think it's less likely that the stories actually relate to Uramu and Barine. I suspect the story is about Lake Itcham, and it's been extended by default really to other places that look the same. And I should point out that I have a new PhD student who just started a few months ago, and he's going to write his doctoral dissertation on Lake Itcham, and so he's going to collect the Aboriginal stories firsthand. He's going to get a boat and he's going to go out into the middle of the lake. He's going to find the deepest part. He's going to go down through the sediments and get something right from the bottom of those sediments to determine the age of the volcanic eruptions. So, yeah, very tough lad. I'm going to sit on the shore and watch it. tend to be rather a hands-off person in those kinds of situations. Okay, and then the second place I wanted to talk about is Kimbra. Kimbra is not a Maar crater lake. Kimbra is inland, and it's not a place where many people go, I have to say. It's the land of the Aboriginal group called the Gugu Badun, and they have many stories. And this is not my research, this is research by a colleague of mine called Ben Cohen. And Ben found that one of the Aboriginal stories of the Gugu Badun talked about how one day a witch doctor made a huge pit in the ground. He was stirring it up, and he filled the air with dust, and that dust spread out across the whole country, and it made people choke and asphyxiate. It killed people, disorientated. You couldn't see where you were going, and it killed many people. And this is just exactly the type of thing that you would expect from a volcanic eruption that gave out lots of toxic gas. And you see that happening in other parts of the world where you have volcanic eruptions. So it's a very odd story to invent, but it is plausible as a recollection of this type of volcanic eruption. And the other story that was collected from the Google balloon was about how the watercourses filled with water. So the people living in this part of Queensland, they depended obviously very heavily on the water that flowed down through the river channels, and they recall that during the events, the watercourses that flowed through the area caught fire. How can a river catch fire? Okay. But what Ben and his colleagues did was they went out there and they reconstructed the volcanic eruption of Kimbra, and they found that this is an old river valley. They found that the lavas coming out of the volcanoes actually followed the river valleys down, as you would expect. Okay, if you're going to pour water on a landscape, that water is going to find the valleys and follow the valleys down. And it's the same thing with lava. It's going to follow the path of least resistance. So what you're actually looking at here is an infilled river valley that became filled with lava at this time. The Kimbra eruption occurred about 7,000 years ago and did indeed produce lava flows that ran rapidly along river valleys of this kind. So the last part of what I want to say is what might all this mean? Okay. So bluntly speaking, what this means is that Australian Aboriginal cultures have preserved, through oral means, memories of events that occurred many millennia ago. Many millennia ago. In the case of the volcanic eruptions at Kimbra, perhaps 7,000 years. In the case of the origin of Lake Beecham, perhaps more than 9,000 years. And this is consistent with what we know from the drowning stories. Now, I want to just step aside slightly and just say, when we talk about these stories being passed down from one generation to the next, it's not just orally. We are starting to realize that a lot of Australian Aboriginal artwork was not created for any aesthetic reason. It was created as a memory prompt. It had practical meaning. And in fact, the more I read about this and the more I learn about it, the more I'm starting to realize that art as we know it today never really existed in the past. When people created artworks, it was for a purpose, a very practical purpose, particularly in non-literate societies. So there's a very good book by Lynn Kelly called The Memory Code. Yes, I would thoroughly recommend that. Okay, and she talks about how artwork, particularly in Australia, was used as an aid memoir to help people remember details of particular stories. Because if I tell you a story and you tell someone else the story and someone else tells that story on and on, the details are going to get lost. But if you have a piece of paper, okay, if you have a piece of paper, even if it doesn't have writing on, even if it just has pictures on, then those pictures can jog your memory. They can make you remember key details. So, in a way, Australian Aboriginal rock art was like writing. It wasn't writing, but it was literacy of a kind, because it had a purpose beyond simply the aesthetic. So, that's that. And Captain Watidi, he was one of the main informants, I think. He was one of the main informants for the drowning stories that we had
from Northern Australia. So what might all this mean? It's testimony to the extraordinary efficacy of Aboriginal methods of transgenerational knowledge transfer. Okay? What that means is that in many societies, and a lot of my research career has been spent in the Pacific Islands, and in the Pacific Islands, if a tradition or a story has lasted more than 700 years, you think, yeah, probably not, okay? But in Australia, we're talking about 7,000 years, okay? So the way in which knowledge was passed on from one generation to the next must have been extraordinarily effective. And then you ask why? And the answer to that question, I believe, is because of Australia itself, which is a really hard place to live. Not for us, okay? It's a hard place to live if you're walking from place to place. You're looking for food, you're looking for water, okay? It's a very harsh environment. So if you want your descendants to survive, and for their descendants to survive in the future, if you want your bloodline to continue, you have to pass on your knowledge very precisely from one generation to the next. So you have to be very, very careful. And we know from anthropological studies that what often happened in Aboriginal groups was that knowledge was passed down one bloodline and then it was cross-checked by a parallel bloodline in both directions. So you would quiz your cousins, or even people who are unrelated to you, and saying, well, what do you know about this? Oh, you've got that wrong, go back and check it, because it's important. So the extraordinary efficacy of knowledge transfer, already demonstrated, like I said, for stories of coastal drowning, and I haven't had time really to talk about the stories of meteorite falls, and this is my colleague from Monash University, Dr. Dwayne Hammaker, and he has been doing a lot of very interesting research about meteorite falls, and in Australian Aboriginal stories, as elsewhere in the world, there are many stories about rocks falling from the sky and crashing to the ground and making craters in the ground. A good example is the Henbury meteorite craters, which are somewhere in the desert, several hundred kilometers to the west of Alice Springs. The first Europeans to get to this area talked to the local indigenous people, and they called the place Chindu China Waru Chinayabu, which means sun, walk, fire, devil, rock. Okay, and again, it's a bit thin evidence, but it does suggest that people had witnessed or at least understood the origin of these meteorite craters, which formed in this case about 4,200 years ago. But a word of caution, okay? It's also clear to my colleague Dwayne Hammaker from Monash that a lot of people in Aboriginal Australia have walked around the country and have seen meteorite craters and have created a story about their formation because they know how meteorite craters form. So there are meteorite craters in Australia that are 4 or 5 million years old, like Wolf Creek, about which there are Aboriginal stories, but they can't possibly be eyewitness accounts because it occurred long before Homo sapiens came into being, let alone Australia was inhabited. So there are a few caveats about meteorite stories, but certainly not about the volcano stories. So here we are. That might be the bullin, it might not be the bullin. Who knows? So in conclusion, I think this is almost my last slide. I think this is my last slide. Maybe we've underestimated the time depth of oral traditions, and I was talking to a group of students at the university about this a couple of days ago, and I made the point that literacy confers arrogance, and this is not a judgment, but once you've learned to read and write, what time have you got for people's stories? Okay, And I see this a lot in the Pacific Islands. You know, the old generation, the people in their 70s and 80s, never went to school, never learned to read or write, but they have a host of stories in their heads. But the younger generation, they're all on their phones all the time. They speak English, they speak their indigenous languages. They are global citizens, and they haven't got time for the stories of their grandparents, which is a great shame, because those stories are eventually going to get lost. So I think literacy conveys or brings a type of arrogance. And I think that by understanding the kinds of things I've been talking about today, we could say that perhaps we've underestimated the time, depth of oral traditions, and also the content. Perhaps there are things in there that we won't know from any other source. And maybe what we once dismissed as fables, inventions, ramblings, are in fact recollections of historical events that can supplement science. Okay, so today's presentation, I've given it on the lands of the Gubbi Gubbi people, and I acknowledge that. And the stories that I've talked about, as far as I'm aware, they are owned by those groups, and I'm grateful, of course. And an article based on this presentation did appear in the conversation. I think in fact, I'm sure that the web link is at the end of that. So thank you all very much.
Now we'll have time for some questions, and please just wait for the microphone to get to you before you ask the question, so everyone can hear. Now, I handed out a lot of handouts at the back, but they didn't seem to come down the front. If you are with someone and they have a handout, could you share it, please? Would you and then pass on any spare copies down to the front? Because the people in the front rows didn't get any at all, so that would be very, very good. Okay, Barry, go for it. I think you've got the microphone.
Thank you, Patrick. Once again, very, very enlightening. Patrick, these weaknesses in the Earth's mantle, like here on the eastern side of Australia, is there much scientific known about them? Did they always exist since the Earth formed, or were they formed from the pressure inside the Earth? And is the interior of the Earth cooling gradually? I mean, it's been around for hundreds of millions of years.
Well, the easy answer is the one to your second question, which is the Earth's interior cooling? Yes, it is, but so slowly I don't think it's even can even be measured. But you would expect any kind of body that was once in a semi-liquid state to be gradually cooling down. But going back to the mantle plumes, so they have a life of about 70 or 80 million years, and they, if you can imagine the Earth's crust like that, the surface of the Earth like that, so underneath the solid crust there's a layer of liquid rock, and from that layer of liquid rock sometimes you get blobs rising up underneath the surface, and these are the mantle plumes, and they can sometimes feed lava up to the Earth's surface and make volcanoes. One of the oldest mantle plumes is the one that underlies the Hawaiian Islands in the northern Pacific, and we know that the crustal plate has been moving in a northwesterly direction for about 90 million years now, and the plume is still underneath the big island of Hawaii, which is why you get volcanic eruptions there, and shows no signs of getting smaller. So that may be because it's in an oceanic situation rather than the continental situation. They're not everywhere. I would guess that there's probably about 30 or 40 in the world, but yes, they are extraordinarily persistent. And the one that I referred to at the end of the Cosgrove track now lies underneath the northern part of Tasmania. And when that scientific conclusion was first announced, and nothing to do with me, there was obviously a degree of anxiety amongst people living in northern Tasmania. So again, you're much better off on the sunny coast thinking of relocating. But again, not being flippant. You can have a mantle plume underneath where you live, and it doesn't mean that lava can get to the Earth's surface. So the very presence of a mantle plume doesn't mean that there's going to be an eruption. But yeah, these things exist, no question.
Just partly related, Patrick. We always talk about Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders as two separate groups. Everyone tells us how long the Aboriginals have been here. What about Torres Strait Islanders?
That's a really interesting question, and I don't know the answer to it, and I wouldn't pretend to be an expert on that. But my understanding is that there's been more mixture with other groups in the Torres Straits than there has been in mainland Australia, and that mixing of different ethnic groups or cultural groups has actually led to a distinct appearance. And I'm not really an expert in that area, but it happens in the Pacific a lot. So in the Pacific Islands, people will often talk about Polynesians and Melanesians, and they're all in fact the same people. And I don't have much time for people who insist that they're different, because they're not. And if you live in countries like Fiji, then you can see that those sorts of people live side by side, so they're part of a cultural continuum. The point is that people have migrated into the Pacific after the first waves of migration, and they've mixed with the people that they first encountered. So Melanesians represent a much more mixed group than do Polynesians, who are much further out in the Pacific. So I suspect that a lot of the distinctions in race that we see today are in fact fairly recent changes to a population that was much more homogeneous.
Mount Fox up out of Innisfail, at that very volcanic area, and that waterfall. What's the big waterfall? Wallen Falls? Yeah, fantastic area. That Mount Fox appears to be a very recent one on top of a volcano. It's all huge boulders, not just lava, flow. Do you know?
We climbed it.
I'm really sorry, I don't know anything about that.
Billy Slater comes from there, doesn't he? Isn't that where Billy Slater's from? And that's one of his favourite places. That's why I read that the other day.
Oh, you're a football fan. I agree.
No.
Oh yes, I'd just like to ask a question. You've given us a very good insight to the prehistoric role of Aboriginal folklore, if you would call it that, which is now being extended into scientific research. I've spent a little time in the Northern Territory and Central Australia as a phyroecologist, and of course Aboriginals had an enormous influence on the flora and fauna of Australia over the time that they were custodians of the landscape, using fire regularly, frequencies and seasons of occurrence at particular intensities, which had a direct impact on the ecology. So there is actually a recent history going back to 65,000 years that really has never been tapped. And I worked with an anthropologist in the Northern Territory in Kimbra National Park before it was fully established. And he lived with Aboriginal communities for many years. And he gleaned from them an absolute wealth of information, such that, for example, there were 7 seasons that the Aboriginals recognised in the monsoon climate, not 2, the wet and the dry, or the build-up was 3. And as a result of that, he was able to understand the interaction between fire, Aboriginal and the landscape. Now, it goes even further than that. And the other thing that I learned up in there was the fact that whilst you spoke about artwork reflecting history and an understanding or record of the Aboriginals' interaction with the environment, their corroborees and songlines were actually the oral mechanism by which they transferred this knowledge, as you said, not for aesthetic reasons, but from a knowledge point of view, because they were the first custodians dependent on the landscape, therefore they had to understand the landscape, and because they were nomadic and never stayed in one place any great period of time and moved with the season, all this information was absolutely crucial for their survival. Now this leads me to my main question, and this is what I can never understand in 42 years of research, why Aboriginal culture and knowledge has not been compiled into some kind of compendium. And the thing that really I don't understand is why hasn't the academic institutions established departments of Aboriginal culture which looks into all of the aspects that before the advent of man, white man came to Australia. Why hasn't that been collected and analysed and documented and provided as a storehouse of wealth of information that the European colonists could understand and build on over time? Because when I first went into developing fire regimes for the sustainable management of our forests and woodlands, the information was already there. The Aboriginals have been doing that for 60,000 years or so, depending on where they were. And yet this information has just been ignored and lost, and therefore not utilised, which means there's been a massive resource that we haven't tapped. And you touched on it with your presentation, and I'm glad you did, because it does lead to the fact, why isn't there Aboriginal institutions that have the opportunity to provide us with information about our country dating back to their time?
Really good question. Really good question, and I suspect you know the answer already.
Yes.
No, the answer. There are a number of answers. There is still a cross-cultural. There is still an arrogance between cultures in many different parts of the world, and we see it in Australia. And I think when Europeans first came to Australia, they were convinced, as they were in other places. When they first came, they were convinced that their ways were better, even though what they knew from Europe was completely inappropriate in the Australian environment. They knew and they imposed their ways, and the indigenous people didn't have a voice that was sufficiently loud to counter that. And I think that's a trend that has continued. Now, in all fairness, there are institutes around Australia which have been documenting Indigenous knowledge about Australia and its environment for a while, but I think at the end of the day, anyone would say that they were inadequate in the sense that there's an awful lot of information being lost. But it's not just in Australia, it's throughout the world that the wisdom of Indigenous peoples is being subordinated to sort of global forces and global knowledge. And you see it in the Pacific all the time. I was talking to someone who works not for Australian Aid, but for one of the other aid organisations recently, and this government had bought 25 water tanks for this outlying island community that was always affected by drought. And they put them on a ship and they took them out to the island and they said, here's your 25 water tanks. And they said, oh, but there's only 12 houses on the island. Oh, okay. Anyway, take them anyway. And the water tanks were this high, and the roofs of the houses were this high. So actually getting the water tanks to fill with water was pointless. The point I'm trying to make here is that we often think that one way is better than another way. And certainly at the time that Australia became a British colony, and it's happened in the Pacific as well, there were sort of racial aspects to the conversation that really meant that no one was going to take any notice of what Indigenous people had to say. From my perspective, I'm just grateful that there were some sufficiently enlightened and sufficiently curious literate people amongst the Europeans that first settled Australia to actually go around and gather these stories, because it would have been very, very easy for these types of stories to have been lost altogether. Okay, if no one had an interest if no one had suspected what you know very well, which is that indigenous people had a wealth of knowledge extending back 60,000 years or so, and had tried to collect some of that knowledge, we wouldn't even have this. So, look, a really good point.
Yeah. It's always just, I wondered why we accept the Noah's Ark story and all the things in the Old Testament. They're no problem, their stories can be done, and nobody's ever denied that they think this thing happened, but why is that then? What story is that?
Okay, well, I can tell you with 99.9% confidence that there was never a global flood. So there simply isn't enough water around to cause a global flood. And I think what's happened with stories like that of Noah's Ark, which have parallels in many other cultures, even in Hindu cultures, I was reading about the global flood the other day. So it has parallels. It's when something happens, when a flood event affects a particular community, then they remember the time of the Great Flood, and then another flood event comes along, and they exaggerate the original story, and it goes on and on and on until it becomes a global flood in which only the mountaintops were sticking out. So I think it's human nature to embellish and to exaggerate stories, particularly those that are passed down from generation to generation, which is why these sorts of stories are really so remarkable. So look, I suppose the answer is that not every single story necessarily has a grounding in fact. Although I was reading an Italian geologist the other day who was writing about the Loch Ness Monster, and he was saying, of course there's no plesiosaur or anything else swimming around in Loch Ness, but Loch Ness lies, the axis of Loch Ness lies along the Great Glen Fault, which is one of the most active geological faults in Scotland. And sometimes when you get movements along that fault, the water surface vibrates in such a way that you get things that, to a Scotsman standing on the shore, could look in fact like a monster. Okay, so yeah, but no monster, but again, not ungrounded in fact.
Yes, Patrick. We have in the last few years, to my knowledge, I was in the National Park and felt an earth tremor, which was supposed to be 120 kilometres below the sea surface of Fraser Island, and there might have been another shallow one more recently as well. So, do Michael Aborigines have words for these happenings and volcanic occasions? And there's a lot of volcanic plugs around here on the coast.
I don't know. Like I say, I work with an Aboriginal linguist, Nick Reed from the University of New England, and he and I have collaborated now for a number of years, and he would probably be able to answer that question. Again, in the Pacific, where I've spent most of my research career, they do have words. So in Fiji, for example, the word tavur or tafur or tavuyanga, it's for a young volcano. And it's probably a word that derived from a time when people saw a young volcano erupting. And now it's been applied to everywhere where you've got a place that looks like a young volcano. So there's a town called Tavor on the north coast of the main island in Fiji, Viti Levu, and hasn't been a volcano erupting there for 30 million years, but there's still an association with something that happens. So I think words are very important, and even more important, I think, are place names. So again, this is not an area of research that I've ever strayed into, but I have colleagues who are very interested in place names and what they might recall about things that happened in a particular place.
I was fortunate to live in New Guinea for almost 30 years at Madang, and it had a great string of islands up the coast, all by distance, able to be got there by boat. Started with Long Island with your wonderful big lake in the middle of it, crocodiles and heaven only. Then there was Kaka, which was active off and on all the time. I actually, 3 days before I left, actually walked up there with my children, which was wonderful. Actually, the little Cessna that took us over, we actually flew around the crater because there was a new crater a new little volcano in the crater. Very interesting, and we had trade stores It went from Noosa, Manum, that was a lot there. I went up with a volcanologist, Tony Taylor, who incidentally died from a heart attack when a couple of years later. But Manum was wonderful there because my husband was on a trawler, and we actually had to keep back, actually watched the lava flow right down and the rocks coming out and the lava flow, and actually went ashore with him and was sort of jerked around while he put all his seismic sort of things there. Absolutely fantastic, and it rained and all the hummus and on the deck, and fascinating and that. But the natives didn't want to go. They loved it there. Couldn't wait to get back. And all the bananas would be coming up through the pumice, about a week after it was there. Anyway, fascinating time. Fascinating.
Thank you.
Also went to Tanner and walked up that. And Vanuatu in Tanner Island.
Oh, yes.
Bit scary. Rocks landing round about you.
Many people have.
In terms of climate change, which is more important, volcanoes or man?
Volcanoes or?
Man.
In terms of climate change? People. Yeah, no question. So we certainly know that large volcanic eruptions can change the Earth's climate for short periods of time. So there have been things in human history called volcanic winters, and Vanuatu, there was a big volcanic eruption about 700 years ago, and that put so much ash into the stratosphere that it floated around the Earth, and it actually led to a drought of about 3 years duration in Northern Europe and North America. And it actually played a role in the siege of Constantinople, which was under siege by the Ottoman Empire at the time. So volcanic eruptions can have short-term effects, but when we're talking about modern climate change and climate change over the last few hundred years, the finger points squarely at people, yes.
I've never heard the call of an emu. Could you give us an
I'm sure there's someone in the room who does an emu impersonation far better than I do.
It's a deep drumming sound that you can hear for a long way in the bush.
Exactly.
Sort of
Absolutely
how
terrifying.
didgeridoo.
Absolutely terrifying. Okay.
Yes, Professor Nunn, I was intrigued with some stories about Aboriginal stories talking about warm cooking pots. My little mind just sort of suggests something like a little local barbecue where you can walk up to and do your cooking. But presumably if it's warm coming up from the earth, it would cover a fair area, and the Aborigines didn't have any feet cover, so can you explore a little bit about what these warming points might have been or how they might have been created?
Well, there are parallels. I mean, if you go to the North Island of New Zealand and you go to Rotorua and places like that, I mean, there are places there before they became tourist attractions where people used to cook, and you find it in other parts of the world, or that sort of thing in other parts of the world. Beyond the details that are in the story that you've seen, I don't know anything else. So speculating is, I think probably the ground was hot enough to cook food in, or at least it was temperature assisted. So you couldn't cook food in the ground here, but maybe if you cooked food in the ground there and you made a fire, it was enough. I'm really sorry.
Especially the bushfowls, our bushfowls would love the vale because they are the megapodes over there, the different ones. They bury their eggs in certain parts of the vale. They know exactly where to put it, put the bill down and find exactly where. Amazing. And of course the people are absolutely amazing. They just have nice cooked eggs. They know where they got them, and it's a wonder the poor birds survive. But how they find exactly where to put them and they don't get boiled, maybe they do put them somewhere. They get them. I don't know. I wish I'd gone into it more at the time.
Well, Patrick, I think you've exhausted everybody with your wonderful answers to their many and varied questions. I think it's quite an extraordinary array of questions, so thank you very much to you, the
Thank you all
audience.
very much.
And thank you very much,
You're most
Patrick. You're always so very welcome. Now, Patrick, I know you've probably got one of these. But Christmas is coming up. Maybe
Thank you so
you could
much.
share it with someone. But it's always nice to share our beautiful Noosa with our guest speakers. And thank you to everybody. And remember, next week we're talking about frogs. Something back to nature, looking at some of the species that are now extinct. So thank you very much for coming, everybody, and see you next week.